Because I think to the general public, it's not clear why Russia still sees the West as an enemy. Is it because it feels threatened because it's not part of NATO?
Well, two answers which aren't necessarily compatible. One is that Russia is overfond of geopolitics. It tries to explain everything in geopolitical terms, but also in zero-sum terms. So Russia's rise has to be at the expense of somebody else's decline. That kind of thinking is pretty deep-rooted in the Kremlin. The other possible answer is the kind of nihilism that you get in some kind of 19th century Russian novels. Destructive action for the sake of destructive action, with no sense of gain, even just the kind of pleasure in inflicting harm on others. Of the two, the first explanation is probably the more convincing, that Russia is locked into this kind of zero-sum way of thinking. Its rise, its recovery is not possible without the decline, damage inflicted on its enemies.
Okay, so it sees its own decline and doesn't really know how it can reclaim its.
Well, Russia thinks it's rising back.
In what way? By what measure? Economically?
Well, in terms of political and geopolitical clout, Russia thinks that its methods are working. So there are really two zero-sum calculations here. One is Russia thinks that its rise has to be at the expense of the decline in the West, but what it isn't really thinking about is the kind of long-term line for Russia itself. You know, these short-term gains could easily come at the expense of serious long-term losses. So what looks like success in knocking your neighbours and your rivals down isn't necessarily a gain at all for Russia in the long run. Russia doesn't have many friends. It has many frenemies, but it's not exactly winning allies through soft power and attraction. It's coercing friendship at best, and creating frenemies out of friends. So there may well be longer term costs for Russia to bear that it isn't really considering properly at the moment.
And in terms of its own journey to democracy, we've seen opposition leaders gun down, the poisoning of this, even here in Britain, in 2018, and now poisoning, I think the most prominent opposition leader, Navalny. How can it be so bold? Is it because it knows the will isn't there in the international community to curtail its actions?
Well, partly it's demonstration, performance politics, but also kind of demonstration power. The Russians think they can show their power by showing the lack of effective pushback or restraint on that power. They're showing that they can get away with anything, almost. So there's a kind of performative aspect of some of these things as well. Even though these things are brutal and cynical, like poisoning your opponents. It's partly designed to intimidate and partly designed to show that Russia has escalatory dominance. It can do the kind of things that others don't even think of doing.
This might sound like a strange question, but do you and your colleagues ever feel afraid of studying the Kremlin?
Well, I guess there are things to be wary of. But there are also things about which it's important to be analytically and morally clear, rather than equivocate or make excuses for Russia. That would be a worse sin, I think.
How do you think our governments make excuses for Russia?
Oh, you see that all the time. That we buy into kind of parts of Russian narrative about how Russia is threatened by the West, or that Russia has special interests in its so-called near abroad, so we don't take the sovereignty of these states seriously. All the time you see elements of Western governments buying into not the entire package of the Russian narrative, but enough parts of it to sort of disable any sort of effective response. Our own government also has problems with financial links between the governing party and Russia, and the kind of Londonograd phenomena of the network of Russian influence and capital being very important to certain strategic interests within Britain, which explains the kind of softer line that we all too often take. So again, there are many faults of our own that we need to look at, not just Russia.
And why do you think that's not? Why do you think India isn't going harder after those interests? Because that is really the threat to the democracy. All of our democracies is this alliance between special interests and the Russian government and the Russian elites, and this money.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an alliance. You know, there's no formal treaty here. But yeah, there are interests who benefit from Russian money and Russian capillaries of influence, and there are informal means, political donations in particular, by which Russian interests try and protect those capillaries of influence, not just in Britain, but in many European states. But Britain, because of the importance of the City of London, because of the importance of London as a global capital, and because of the lightly regulated, offshore world of British dependencies, is particularly vulnerable to these capillaries of Russian influence.